It's the late summer of 1945, just after Japan's surrender. The world is still recovering from the catastrophic aftermath of war. A group of Japanese women, once soldiers, factory workers, and civilians, are now prisoners of war. After years of enduring physical and emotional suffering in Allied captivity, they are liberated by American forces. The camp, which had been their home for so long, now feels different, but it is still steeped in uncertainty. The women, though free, are disoriented, caught between the trauma of their past and the unknown future ahead. Then one morning, a small but profound gesture is made. American women, part of the post-war humanitarian effort, walk into the camp with an unexpected gift: magazines. At first, the women POWs are stunned, unsure of how to react. These magazines, filled with pictures, stories, and advertisements from a world so far removed from their daily lives in captivity, feel like something out of a dream. The idea that they could be handed something so normal, so civilian, seems absurd. Yet, in the pages of these magazines, they find something more than just entertainment. They find a glimpse of a peaceful world, a return to normalcy, and a symbol of the kindness of their former enemies. As the women flip through the pages, they are filled with a mix of emotions: disbelief, gratitude, and even guilt. The magazines, so simple, so innocent, become symbols of something far larger, of compassion, of peace, and of the shared humanity that had been lost amidst the brutality of war. For the first time since their capture, these women experience a connection not born from violence or survival, but from the kindness of strangers, women just like them, who saw beyond the uniform and the nationality to offer something truly meaningful. In the years leading up to and during World War II, Japanese women were subjected to a complex array of roles, shaped by the ideologies of the militaristic state. Their primary duties were to support the war effort and to embody the ideals of sacrifice, loyalty, and service to the emperor. Much like women in other countries during wartime, Japanese women were called upon to fill the gaps left by men who went off to fight. However, unlike women in Western nations, Japanese women were also deeply integrated into the state's military and industrial machinery, often in ways that were both invisible and essential to the war effort. Women worked in factories, as nurses, and in service roles within the military. By 1944, as Japan faced mounting losses and a dwindling labor force, many women were conscripted into military service in auxiliary roles, such as in the Women's Volunteer Labor Corps. They were tasked with roles that ranged from operating anti-aircraft batteries to working in wartime factories, often under extremely difficult conditions. While these women were seen as integral to the war effort, they were also frequently subjected to the same hardships as their male counterparts: grueling work hours, inadequate food and medical care, and the constant threat of air raids. However, by the war's end, many of these women were captured by American forces. With Japan's surrender in 1945, Allied POW camps began to house not just soldiers but civilians, including the women who had been a part of Japan's military and industrial workforce. For these women, their wartime service and the ideological conditioning that had shaped their lives gave way to a harsh new reality. They were now prisoners, no longer soldiers or workers but enemies, stripped of their identities and forced to endure the emotional and physical toll of captivity. Their time in POW camps was marked by uncertainty, fear, and deprivation. While many of the male prisoners faced forced labor and intense interrogation, the women were often subjected to a different kind of suffering. The emotional toll of captivity for women was particularly harsh, as they were forced to reconcile their roles as both contributors to the war effort and victims of its destructive aftermath. These women, who had been raised to embody the ideals of loyalty and duty, now found themselves trapped in a liminal space, neither fully combatants nor entirely innocent civilians, but a mixture of both. When the war ended, Japan's defeat was total and unconditional. The nation was left in ruins, both physically and psychologically. The imperial system that had defined Japan for centuries was shattered, and with it, the hierarchical structures that had long governed the lives of Japanese people. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the occupying Allied forces, particularly the American military, were tasked with rebuilding the country. This included not just the restoration of infrastructure, but the difficult and delicate process of reconciliation, of addressing the deep wounds caused by the war, and by the ways in which Japan's military and civilian populations had been shaped by the conflict. For the Japanese women held in POW camps, liberation by American forces did not bring an immediate sense of peace. While they were freed from captivity, the trauma of war remained. The shock of Japan's surrender had left the women disoriented. They had been raised to believe in the righteousness of their cause, to uphold the emperor's authority and to fight to the death if necessary. Now, they were forced to grapple with the brutal reality of defeat and their role in a war that had ended in devastation. The post-war American occupation, under General Douglas MacArthur, aimed to demilitarize and democratize Japan. As part of this process, American forces made efforts to provide humanitarian aid to civilians and prisoners alike, understanding that the psychological effects of war could be just as damaging as the physical ones. Yet the healing process was slow and complex, especially for those who had been on the losing side. For many Japanese POWs, their liberation came with a deep sense of humiliation, guilt and shame, and the difficult journey of coming to terms with their past was further complicated by their status as enemy combatants. Of the more profound and subtle aspects of post-war, rehabilitation was the role of American women in this process. Women were sent to POW camps as part of the broader humanitarian effort to provide comfort and support to female prisoners. It was in this context that American women began bringing small yet powerful gifts to the liberated Japanese women: magazines. In the midst of their suffering, these magazines served as a reminder of the normalcy and peace that had once existed before the war, offering glimpses into civilian life, a world the Japanese women had been cut off from during their years of captivity. At first, the Japanese women POWs were confused by the gesture. Magazines seemed like an odd gift, far removed from the necessities they had come to expect. They were used to food, clothing, medical care, and safety, but magazines? What could such a simple item provide? Yet as the women began to leaf through the pages, something unexpected happened. The magazines, filled with stories of daily life, fashion, and entertainment, became a window into a world of peace and normalcy. In a way, they were a symbol of the world these women had lost, but also of the world they might one day be able to return to. This small gesture, the gift of reading material from women who had been their former enemies, became much more than just a material offering. It was an act of empathy, a bridge between two nations, and a recognition that beyond the uniforms and the political ideologies, both groups of women shared a common humanity. The American women who brought the magazines understood that the Japanese women, despite being on the losing side of the war, were not merely victims of their own government's decisions, but individuals who had suffered immensely during the conflict. War strips people of many things: their homes, their families, their peace of mind. But perhaps the most profound loss is the loss of one's humanity. This is a theme often explored in wartime narratives, where people are reduced to mere soldiers or enemies, forced into roles defined by national identity or ideology. The Japanese women POWs, however, experienced a different loss: the erosion of their identity as individuals. When they were liberated by American forces, they were not only freed physically but emotionally as well. The act of receiving magazines, a seemingly simple gesture, was a powerful reclaiming of their humanity. These women had spent years in captivity, their lives defined by the cruelty of their captors and the harsh conditions of war. The majority had been cut off from the comforts of normal life for so long that they had forgotten what it felt like to be treated as humans. Their identities had been stripped away, replaced by the harsh reality of survival. In captivity, they had been reduced to mere prisoners, numbers in a ledger, bodies in a camp. The magazines brought by American women brought with them something that was not only a symbol of the outside world, but a reminder of their worth beyond their wartime roles. When the magazines were first presented, the Japanese women were stunned. They had not expected such a gift, and at first it seemed almost incongruous with their current reality. How could a magazine, filled with advertisements for clothing, recipes, and celebrity news, be of any significance after what they had endured? But as they flipped through the glossy pages, their initial confusion gave way to something much deeper, a sense of recognition. The magazines were a window into the life they had once known, one filled with peace, normalcy, and routine. For the first time in years, they could see what life was like beyond the camp, a life that was not defined by hardship or war. What struck them most about the magazines was not just the content, but the recognition that someone from the other side of the war, from a country they had been taught to hate, cared enough to offer them something so simple yet so deeply human. It was a profound moment of empathy. In a war where the brutality of the enemy was taught and reinforced by propaganda, this simple gift shattered the walls of animosity. The women who received the magazines were not just enemy combatants. They were women, mothers, daughters, people deserving of kindness, understanding, and respect. For many of the Japanese women, the magazines became a symbol of the broader emotional shift they experienced in the wake of their liberation. The emotional relief they felt was not just from being freed from captivity, but from the recognition that they were seen as human beings once again. In their time of desperation, when the future seemed uncertain and filled with trauma, the magazines were a reminder that their lives could, in fact, move forward. They could heal. They could be part of a world that was not solely defined by war. This act of kindness, though simple, had profound emotional implications. The magazines allowed these women to confront the painful past, but they also offered a glimpse of a hopeful future. The war had stolen so much from them, including their dignity and their identity. Yet through the magazines, they were reminded that life could still hold meaning beyond survival. They were no longer just victims of the war. They were individuals with the potential for recovery, for reintegration into a peaceful world. As the women read through the pages, they also began to realize the importance of their own voices. Through the pages of the magazines, they could connect with the outside world once again. The act of reading was not just an intellectual exercise. It was a reclaiming of the power to understand, to feel, and to think freely. The magazines gave these women something more than entertainment or distraction. They gave them a sense of belonging in a world beyond the camp, a world that could one day be rebuilt. For the American women who brought these magazines to the POW camps, the act was not just about offering entertainment. It was about recognizing the shared humanity of the women they had once seen as enemies. In providing such a simple gift, the American women acknowledged that beyond the war, beyond the destruction, there was still room for kindness, empathy, and understanding. They understood that after all the loss, the Japanese women needed more than just food or shelter. They needed the chance to reconnect with the world, to be reminded that they were not forgotten. Magazines in the context of wartime captivity may seem like an odd gift. They are not life-saving, nor are they directly practical in the way food or medical care might be. Yet for the Japanese women POWs, magazines held deep cultural significance. More than mere entertainment, they represented a bridge to normalcy, a fleeting connection to a world of peace and civilian life that had been lost during the war. The simple pages filled with images of fashion, advertisements, stories, and pictures of family life were a reminder of the world they had known before the war and, perhaps more importantly, a symbol of what might lie ahead. In the years of captivity, the Japanese women had been cut off from the world they once inhabited. Their lives, once filled with routine, family, community, and cultural rituals, had been replaced with the brutal, dehumanizing routine of survival. They had been denied the luxury of leisure, of thought, and of personal expression. The magazines offered more than just a distraction. They were a rare and unexpected opportunity to reconnect with a part of life that had been stripped away. For these women, flipping through the pages of a magazine was not just an act of reading. It was a reconnection with the world they had lost. Magazines, particularly in the post-war era, were a symbol of civilian life. They presented a world where the horrors of war had not yet reached, a world defined by family, culture, and individual identity. As the women thumbed through the pages, they were exposed to a different way of living, one that involved not just surviving but thriving in a peaceful society. The imagery in the magazines offered a stark contrast to the harsh reality they had known in the POW camps, where every day had been a struggle for basic needs. The glossy images of fashion, advertisements for consumer goods, and stories about ordinary life felt almost like a dream, offering them a glimpse of a world beyond the brutality of the war and its aftermath. The gift of magazines also represented a deeper cultural exchange. When the American women entered the camps with their magazines, they were offering not just a material object, but a symbol of peace, kindness, and solidarity. The act of bringing these magazines, often chosen for their ability to lift the spirits and offer hope, demonstrated an understanding that the psychological and emotional recovery of the women POWs would be just as important as their physical rehabilitation. The magazine served as a reminder that, beyond the uniform and the political ideologies, there was something universal, a shared desire for normalcy, dignity, and connection. In a time when the concept of enemy had been entrenched in propaganda and hatred, the act of offering a gift from one group of women to another was a subversive gesture. It was an acknowledgement of shared humanity in the face of war's dehumanizing effects. Magazines in this sense became more than just reading material. They became a vehicle for empathy. The women who received them realized that their former enemies were capable of kindness, of offering something as simple as a magazine to bridge the gap between wartime animosity and post-war understanding. It was a moment of connection that transcended the violence of the past. For the Japanese women, this small gesture, a magazine, allowed them to see themselves as more than just victims of war. It allowed them to reconnect with their own cultural identities, their own sense of normality. Many of these women had been shaped by the rigid structures of wartime Japan, where personal identity was often overshadowed by national duty. Now, in the pages of these magazines, they were reminded that they were not simply members of a defeated nation, but individuals who had lives, stories, and desires beyond the war. The magazines symbolized a future in which they could once again be part of a world where individuality and personal expression were possible. Through the magazines, the women found something that had been absent for so long: the opportunity to think for themselves, to dream, and to imagine a future that was not defined by the trauma of the past. The magazines were a window to a life they had been excluded from, and through them they were able to see the possibility of rebuilding. They could not undo the horrors of the war, but through the simple act of reading, they were reminded that their lives could still hold meaning, that they still had a place in the world. This gift, though simple, was a moment of emotional restoration. It was not just about reading magazines, but about reclaiming a piece of their humanity. It reminded them that despite the devastation of war, there was still beauty in the world, beauty that they were worthy of experiencing. The magazines, in their colorful pages and stories of daily life, became a form of emotional nourishment, reminding the women that life could once again be filled with joy, culture, and individuality. One of the most poignant aspects of this exchange was the involvement of American women in the delivery of magazines to the Japanese women POWs. The gesture of offering magazines, an act typically associated with personal care, connection, and the simple pleasure of reading, was made by women, rather than men, in a war where men had largely dominated the narratives of both combat and victory. This connection, forged through feminine solidarity, carried profound emotional and psychological significance. For the Japanese women POWs, who had been victims of wartime propaganda and ideological indoctrination, receiving a gift from women of the opposing side was not just an unexpected act of kindness. It was a moment of profound human connection. They had been taught to see Americans, particularly the women, as their enemies, the ones responsible for the suffering and devastation that had befallen their country. The idea that women in particular could offer such a simple yet meaningful gift was foreign and deeply disarming. In a world where violence had stripped them of their dignity, the act of American women bringing magazines to their Japanese counterparts was a powerful reminder that, despite the horrors of the war, there was a shared humanity that transcended nationality, military allegiance, and ideology. The American women who brought these magazines understood that the emotional and psychological recovery of the POWs was just as important as the physical one. They recognized that beyond the trauma of war, the Japanese women needed to feel seen, acknowledged, and cared for as human beings. This act of solidarity between women, who had been on opposite sides of the conflict, was a testament to the power of empathy. The American women had not simply delivered material aid, they had offered something far more profound, a recognition that these Japanese women, despite being on the losing side of the war, were still human beings deserving of kindness and dignity. The magazines were a small but deeply symbolic act of compassion, a way of reaching across the divide created by the war and seeing one another as equals rather than enemies. In a time of great suffering, it was an acknowledgement that, While their nations may have been at war, their shared experiences as women, as individuals capable of empathy, compassion, and care, united them. For the Japanese women, the magazines were a form of emotional healing, yes, but they also served as a reminder of the deeper connection that existed between women in the world. These women, despite being caught in the machinery of war, despite being prisoners, were still part of a larger sisterhood of humanity, one that went beyond the borders and battles of national conflict. The magazines became more than just a symbol of post-war recovery. They became a manifestation of feminine solidarity in a time when so much had been shattered. As these women flipped through the magazines, many found themselves looking not just at the stories, but at the faces of the women in the advertisements, the models, and the actresses, women who, like them, had been part of a world that still held beauty, joy, and connection. It was a powerful reminder that despite the horrors of war, there were still places in the world where women could be celebrated for who they were, not just for their roles in a military conflict or as the bearers of national ideology. For the American women who had brought the magazines, it was a quiet rebellion against the cruelty and dehumanization of war. In a moment when everything seemed lost, when national pride had been shattered, they offered something simple but deeply human, a chance for the Japanese women to reconnect with the normalcy of life, to see themselves as more than victims of war, and to reclaim a small piece of their pre-war identity. The emotional and psychological weight of this act was immense for both sides. The American women had been part of the force that defeated the Axis powers, yet they did not see their liberation efforts as an act of vengeance. Instead, they reached out to the women on the other side with kindness, understanding that no matter the national allegiances or political ideologies, the suffering caused by war was universal. This act of feminine solidarity was a bridge that connected them, not just as women but as human beings who, despite their differences, shared a common experience of loss, trauma, and the longing for peace. In the end, the exchange of magazines became a symbol of post-war reconciliation, one that transcended national divisions and spoke to the deeper human need for empathy and connection. The American women, through their simple yet profound act of kindness, helped the Japanese women POWs rebuild their sense of self, reminding them that even in the wake of war, there was space for compassion, and there was always the possibility of healing. The turning point came on the day the first magazines arrived in the camp, carried by American women who had come as part of the post-war humanitarian mission. When the Japanese women POWs were handed these magazines, the initial response was one of confusion and disbelief. After years of deprivation and the constant struggle for survival, the concept of receiving something so trivial, so ordinary, felt almost absurd. A magazine? What use could it serve when survival had been their only concern for so long? As they cautiously flipped through the glossy pages, the women were stunned. The magazines were filled with images of life they had once known, of normalcy, of peace, and of beauty. The articles, stories, and advertisements were not about war or survival, but about the everyday joys of civilian life, recipes, family pictures, fashion, and leisure. For a moment, it was as if the harshness of captivity had been briefly lifted, and they were allowed to step back into a world they had long been separated from. What began as a seemingly trivial gift slowly transformed into something far more profound. For these women who had spent years surrounded by the violence of war and the rigidity of military life, receiving a magazine became a pivotal moment in their emotional and psychological recovery. The magazine symbolized not just a physical escape, but an emotional and intellectual release. For the first time in years, they could reconnect with a world that had been taken from them, a world where joy, family, and normalcy still existed. It was a world beyond the trauma of captivity, beyond the horrors they had witnessed, and beyond the cruelty of war. The shift was not just in what they read, but in how they felt as they read it. The magazines became more than just a distraction. They were a symbol of the kindness offered to them by American women. The act of receiving this gift from women who had once been their enemies was a stark contrast to the treatment they had come to expect. These were women who had seen them as victims, not as enemies. The realization that they were worthy of kindness, that they could receive something as simple as a magazine, was transformative. It shifted their perception of the war, of their captors, and of themselves. For the American women who had brought the magazines, This moment was also a turning point. They had been part of the force that had defeated Japan, but now they were offering a simple gift, not to soldiers or political figures, but to women who had endured the same kinds of suffering they themselves had endured. It was an act that transcended the boundaries of war. It was an offering not just of reading material, but of empathy, and an understanding that despite the years of hostility, women, regardless of nationality, shared a fundamental human experience, that of loss, survival, and the need for connection. The Japanese women, once part of an empire that had sought to dominate and conquer, now found themselves on the receiving end of kindness from those they had once viewed as the enemy. The magazines were not just an emotional balm, they were a symbol of something far deeper, the possibility of reconciliation, of a shared humanity in the aftermath of destruction. In the simple act of sharing a piece of civilian life, the American women offered the Japanese POWs a glimpse of peace, a reminder that beyond the destruction of war, there was still a world to return to. This moment, when these women, who had been separated by the brutality of war, were brought together through the gift of a magazine, became a turning point not only in their individual journeys but in the larger process of post-war reconciliation. It marked a shift in the narrative of the war, where enemy lines were no longer defined by hatred but by shared human experiences. It was a moment of quiet healing, a moment when, for the first time, these women could see each other not as enemies, but as women bound by the same longing for peace and normalcy. The emotional impact of receiving the magazines, an act of kindness from American women, rippled through the lives of the Japanese women POWs long after they were liberated from captivity. What initially seemed like a small gesture, a momentary distraction from the hardships of the camp, became a pivotal experience in their post-war recovery. These women, who had been caught between a world that had been torn apart by war and a future that seemed uncertain, now had a tangible symbol of normalcy and humanity to help guide them through their emotional rehabilitation. For many of the Japanese women, the magazines were a deeply emotional experience. After years of deprivation, captivity, and the constant threat of violence, the magazines allowed them to reconnect with a world that had been lost to them during the war. They had spent years in survival mode where every day was a struggle for food, rest, and safety. The idea of something as simple as a magazine, filled with images of ordinary life, was both surreal and profoundly moving. It was a reminder that despite the horrors they had endured, there was still a world that existed beyond the brutality of the war. The psychological shift that came with receiving the magazines was transformative. These women had been raised in a society where duty to the emperor and to the nation had been paramount, where personal desires and comforts were secondary to the needs of the state. But now, in receiving a gift from women on the other side of the war, they were reminded of their own humanity. It wasn't just about receiving something material, but about being seen, about being acknowledged as human beings worthy of care and compassion. This realization was incredibly healing for women who had spent years being treated as mere prisoners, stripped of their dignity and their agency. Many of the women, after years of silence and suffering, found themselves able to reflect on their experiences in a new light. The magazines gave them the space to process their past, to reflect on their wartime roles, and to begin to heal emotionally. They wrote letters, kept journals, and discussed the feelings that had been buried during the war. The simple act of receiving a magazine gave them a sense of connection, not just with the world they had lost, but with the people who cared for them enough to offer something so deeply personal. It was an emotional release that these women had not expected, but had desperately needed. The emotional impact of the magazines also resonated beyond the immediate context of the POW camps. As these women returned to their lives in post-war Japan, they carried with them the memory of that moment when the barriers of war and enemy lines had been broken down by an act of kindness. This experience played a significant role in the women's ability to reintegrate into their post-war lives. The magazines reminded them that despite the war's destruction, there was still room for human connection and kindness in the world. For many, it was a foundation on which they began to rebuild their own sense of self-worth and purpose. Some women used the experience as a catalyst for change in their own lives. Many pursued education, became involved in post-war rebuilding efforts, and contributed to the reconstruction of a nation that had been devastated They began to share their stories not as victims, but as survivors who had found a way to heal, to move forward, and to embrace the future with a sense of hope. The emotional relief provided by the magazines allowed them to see their own potential beyond the confines of their wartime roles. For others, the emotional impact was more subtle, but just as significant. The magazines were a quiet reminder of the possibility of a life beyond the war, a life that could once again be filled with peace, normalcy, and connection. In receiving something as simple as reading material, they were given a moment of peace in a world that had been torn apart. This brief respite from the constant psychological trauma of the war offered them a moment of clarity, helping them to recognize that they were not defined solely by their wartime experiences. Ultimately, the magazines were a catalyst for emotional recovery, but they also played a role in shifting the collective consciousness of these women. They went from being passive victims of war to active participants in the healing process, empowered by the realization that, despite the horrors of their past, they could still reclaim their dignity, their sense of self, and their place in the world. The magazines were a small but deeply significant symbol of this transformation. The act of American women bringing magazines to Japanese women POWs in the aftermath of WW2 is a small, yet significant moment in the broader context of post-war reconciliation between Japan and the United States. At a time when animosity and mistrust ran deep between the two nations, particularly after the devastation of the war, such acts of kindness were rare, but deeply impactful. The exchange of these simple gifts, magazines filled with civilian life and normalcy, was not just about the immediate emotional relief it provided to the women who received them. It was also a moment of healing, not only for the women involved but for the broader relationship between two nations trying to rebuild from the ashes of war. In the years immediately following Japan's surrender, the country was in a state of total devastation. Not only had it lost the war, but its cities had been bombed, its leadership was being dismantled, and its people were struggling to come to terms with their collective identity after the fall of the empire. The American occupation under General Douglas MacArthur sought to demilitarize Japan, establish a democratic government, and introduce social and economic reforms. This period was marked by a complex and often painful process of rebuilding, both physically and psychologically. For the Japanese people, particularly those who had been part of the war effort, there was no easy way forward. The shame of defeat was compounded by the trauma of a war that had taken millions of lives. For the women in the POW camps, the post-war years were just as complicated. As prisoners, they had experienced profound dehumanization. Now, as liberated individuals, they were left to navigate a society that had not only been defeated, but was now in the process of redefining itself. The emotional scars of captivity were deep, and the process of reintegration into Japanese society was fraught with tension, guilt, and confusion. They had been part of a military machine that had caused immense suffering, and now they faced a world that was rebuilding itself, a world in which their roles and identities were uncertain. The act of receiving the magazines, however, became a quiet symbol of peace. This was not just an act of goodwill from American women, but a sign of a shift in the psychological and cultural landscape between the two nations. By offering something so simple, so civilian, the American women helped to bridge the divide. The magazines were a sign that despite the brutality of the war, there was space for compassion, empathy, and reconciliation. It was a message that even after all the destruction and suffering, the potential for rebuilding relations was not limited to political or military leaders but could be expressed in the most human of terms. This moment, when the American women offered magazines to their former enemies, marked a shift in the cultural narrative surrounding the post-war relationship between Japan and the United States. It was one thing for nations to rebuild politically or economically, but the emotional and cultural scars of the war would take much longer to heal. Small, seemingly insignificant gestures like this one became key in this process. They served as symbolic reminders that humanity could endure beyond the boundaries of war, beyond the flags and the uniforms, and beyond the divisions created by political ideologies. For the American women who gave these magazines, the act was not just an expression of kindness, but also a recognition of the shared suffering that transcended national borders. While they had been part of the victorious side, they understood that the true victory would come not from defeating an enemy, but from creating lasting peace. Peace not just in the political sense, but in the emotional and cultural exchange between nations. The magazines were a small step in that direction, a means of offering a piece of the world that had been lost during the conflict. In the years following the war, Japan and the United States began to rebuild their relationship. The occupation ended in 1952 with the signing of the Treaty of Peace, but the process of reconciliation between the two nations continued for decades. This moment of feminine solidarity, the exchange of magazines between American and Japanese women, became one of the many subtle, personal acts that helped lay the groundwork for the long, difficult process of reconciliation. It represented the possibility that even after the deepest divisions, there could be a shared commitment to peace, to healing, and to understanding. The small yet profound act of offering a magazine also resonated in the larger context of post-war gender dynamics. While the men were the soldiers and the political leaders, it was the women, who had been largely excluded from the formal power structures, who played a significant role in the emotional healing of the post-war period. Women, both Japanese and American, found ways to offer comfort, care, and understanding that went beyond the formal reconciliation efforts of governments. In doing so, they provided an example of how even the most ordinary acts of kindness could contribute to the rebuilding of a broken world. In the wake of war, when nations are shattered and the wounds of conflict run deep, it is often the smallest, most personal acts of kindness that have the most profound impact. The exchange of magazines between American and Japanese women POWs, a simple gesture in the midst of profound suffering, became a symbol of the quiet power of empathy, understanding, and shared humanity. At a time when the emotional and psychological scars of war seemed insurmountable, this act of kindness offered not just a moment of relief, but the possibility of reconciliation, healing, and a new beginning. The magazines were not just pieces of paper filled with stories and pictures. They were symbols of normalcy, of peace, and of a world that existed beyond the violence of war. For the Japanese women who had endured so much, receiving these magazines was more than just receiving reading material. It was a recognition that, despite being on opposite sides of the war, they were still deserving of kindness and care. In that small act of feminine solidarity, the American women showed that empathy transcends national borders, political ideologies, and the divisions created by conflict. For the women who received the magazines, this moment was transformative. It reminded them of the world they had lost, but also offered them hope for the future. It gave them a glimpse of what they could rebuild, not just in terms of their country, but in their own lives. The magazines were a chance to reconnect with a sense of individuality, of normal life, and of the possibility of peace. Through this simple act, they were able to see beyond the trauma of their past and begin to imagine a future filled with the same humanity and compassion that had been extended to them. The exchange was a quiet rebellion against the horrors of war. It was an act that reached across the boundaries of national identity and conflict to offer something much deeper, the recognition of shared human experiences. In a world where enemies were often reduced to caricatures, where propaganda painted the other side as less than human, this gesture was a powerful reminder that, even in the most brutal of conflicts, there are moments of connection that can bridge the deepest divides. As the post-war years unfolded, the significance of this act grew. It was not just a moment of personal relief for the women involved, but a part of a larger process of healing and rebuilding. The act of giving magazines was not just about providing comfort. It was about offering the hope of a future where such acts of empathy and kindness could become the norm, not the exception. It was a reminder that even after the most devastating of wars, there is still room for peace, for understanding, and for the recognition of each other's humanity. In the end, the simple act of bringing magazines to the Japanese women POWs became more than just a symbol of the post-war effort. It was a testament to the enduring power of human connection. No matter how deep the wounds of war may run, the ability to reach out with compassion, to offer kindness in the face of suffering, remains a powerful force for healing. It is in these quiet moments of empathy that the true possibility for reconciliation lies, and it is through acts like these that humanity rebuilds, piece by piece, after the horrors of conflict.